You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 6th of January 2026 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting to you live from Studio 1 here at Midori House in London. I'm Tom Edwards. Coming up on today's programme, we'll have the latest on Venezuela from Oxford Analytica's Nick Redman. Then we'll train a lens on Ukraine and tell you all you need to know about a significant cabinet reshuffle in Kiev. Our Julia Jen is here. What are the headlines, Julia?
Well, we're seeing the biggest political refresh in a long time in Ukraine, with even a former Canadian Deputy Prime Minister joining the fold.
More from Julia on the way. Also joining me here in studio a little later in the show, the one and only, mercifully, Nick Manise, Monocle's design editor. Why? No, Nick, really, why are you here?
Well, I want to talk about my own travel plans for 2026, which will actually be of interest for our listeners.
Can't wait. All that and, yes, more besides, coming up for you on a jam-packed Tuesday edition of The Briefing with me, Tom Edwards. A very warm welcome to this Tuesday edition of the programme, which we will start with Venezuela. The beginning of the end, or the end of the beginning? Neither. Maybe the only thing that is certain is the high risk of making any assumptions. Let's dig deeper into this now with Nick Redman, Editor-in-Chief and Director of Analysis at Oxford Analytica. Nick, a warm welcome to the show. Great to have you with us. Look, a nice quiet start to 2026. People keep saying, oh, well, this wasn't on our bingo cards, but I don't know if they'd been listening to you and your colleagues. Maybe it should have been.
Well, we'd flagged it as possibility from September onwards, because that was when the US military build-up started to take place. But nevertheless, we didn't have much notice that this was actually happening. And for some reason, these things always happen on a weekend, which isn't good for those of us that like to work Monday to Friday.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, let's dig in a bit more detail, Nick, and tell me, I think it's important to make some distinctions, isn't it? People are talking a little bit about regime change, but I know that you sort of prefer regime sort of co-optation, maybe. Just tell me a little bit about why it does matter what labels we apply to this.
So we stick to the facts. What's happened? What has happened is the United States has seized the president of Venezuela and has taken him back home. But on the streets of Venezuela, it's still Maduro's government that's in charge, although some gangs today are flexing their muscles. So what the United States is trying to do is not to replace this regime, as they did in Iraq in 2003, but is trying to co-opt it, to keep it in place. That's why democracy promotion isn't really on the agenda right now, because they understand that the ruling government will not accept Maria Corina Machado or Edmundo Gonzalez, who actually won the 2024 presidential election, at the head of a government. So it's working with the existing regime because they're the ones that can run it. They're the ones that can maintain order and feed people. And so what we're in right now is actually the start of a negotiation between the United States using carrots and sticks in order to try and get that Venezuelan government to hold together and to do what it wants.
Well, that's interesting. And I wonder, is it a question of DC offering carrots or wielding sticks? Because, to what extent can the remnants of the regime even actually do what Trump specifically wants them to do, even if they were minded to?
So they do control the country. So in theory, they have the prospect. But remember, this is a regime that has been built on defiance to the United States for a couple of decades now. And there are some idealists and true believers, as well as some pragmatists. So the stick is a pretty big one in the form of all the US military power offshore and the demonstrated ability to penetrate Venezuelan defenses. And the carrot is more around, well, you can keep your job, you can keep your position and many of your privileges and priorities if you'll do what we want. But it's not clear that everyone is going to fall into line behind that. And on the other hand, you have Venezuelan society, which is going to be fairly appalled at the idea that a very unpopular regime largely remains in place.
Nick, it's understandable perhaps that observers around the world of all kinds of different stripes are looking at this and trying perhaps to extrapolate, well, given this has happened and it happened this way, the implications for, again, take your pick, Cuba, Greenland, whatever, or the Chinese attitude towards Taiwan, this means X, Y, Z. How unhelpful is it, in your view, to do that, as understandable as it may be? And to what degree can we make better assessments of any of those other scenarios based on what we will witness in Caracas in the next few days and weeks?
Yeah, I think what happens is absolutely crucial. And it will affect everyone's calculations, and crucially the Trump administration's appetite for doing anything else. So I think the only thing we can say with confidence right now is, right around the world, some of the expectations that governments had about Donald Trump's inclination to use military force don't look quite so solid. The assumption was that he was talked very tough, but was really quite cautious, was not in favor of using military force very much, very wary of boots on the ground. If you look at his use of force in Iran, for instance, he only authorized those bombers to go in after the Israelis had obliterated Iranian air defense. So the threat to US pilots flying over Iran was really very low. This is rather different. He's actually risked special forces. He's risked some of his naval and Air Force pilots as well to do this. It was a short operation. He hasn't left boots on the ground, but nevertheless, it's not necessarily what you would expect. And so that is the one thing I think that immediately will have changed. But when we think about what the read across is to other situations, I think it massively depends on how this goes. And it's really very unclear where Venezuela is going to go right now, or what the United States is going to do if either this government doesn't comply with the requests, or else if it splinters. If you have a gathering humanitarian crisis in the country, which is entirely possible if this quarantine or blockade continues. So there's an awful lot to play for, and there's an awful lot, I think, that can go wrong.
Well, it's funny, you talk about uncertainty in that context. It's been a common refrain in Trump 1.0 and again in this administration. He's unpredictable. He's volatile. He says one thing, he does another. Interestingly, Nick, is it almost more difficult to calibrate one's expectations if Trump, maybe counterintuitively, starts doing exactly what he says he's going to do, which is kind of what has happened in this instance?
Well, he's done it in a number of cases, but I don't think the first term is a very good guide for what's happening now because of structural factors. So, Trump started out not really with a plan for government, with the Congressional Republican Party not fully behind him, with no bank of officials, no developed program. Whereas this time around, we have a very developed program. He's taken over the Republican Party, which is probably the most astonishing thing, actually, of the post-2020 period, that the loser of the election nevertheless conquered a party that he never controlled when he was president. So you have a deep bank of officials and a lot of thinking and think tank work that has been done on fleshing out an agenda. So the agenda is there. But still at the heart of it is this somewhat mercurial figure who's the ultimate decision maker and will decide where things go. So that does become difficult.
Well, to that point, how hard is the job that you and your colleagues do day to day, Nick? I'm really interested in this because there's been so much recalibration of expectations, whether that's assessments of US foreign policy, mood, domestic US politics, now these foreign policy incursions on other territories. I guess it's kind of interesting, right, in terms of your in trade, but how much of a recalibration or a reassessment of previously fairly safe assumptions is involved with this on a day-to-day basis for you guys?
Yeah, this is not maybe completely new. There's a lot more interest in geopolitics now than there was, say, prior to the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. But in a way, our work hasn't changed. The world is still difficult. The particular problems you have now is, in the past, one could more or less say that United States was a fixed point. And so you were looking at the other actors as the variables. And now you're looking for some of the fixed points elsewhere on the understanding that the United States might be a bit more variable. So it's a different sort of analytical challenge, but it's not an insuperable one.
Well, let's hope so. The best of luck with that, Nick, as you continue your sterling work in 26. Look, really fascinating to speak with you, Nick. Thanks for making some time for us. That was Nick Redman, Editor-in-Chief and Director of Analysis at Oxford Analytica. Right, there is, as Nick alluded to, plenty happening all around the world. Let's find out. Our Carlotta Rebello is standing by in the other studio with today's news headlines.
Thanks, Tom. A coalition of the willing summit is getting underway in Paris, hosted by President Emmanuel Macron, and focus on providing security guarantees for Ukraine that are key to finalizing any future peace deal with Russia. U.S. negotiators Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are also in attendance. Russian strikes on Ukraine overnight killed 2 people and hit a medical clinic in the country. Pope Leo has sealed shut a special holy door in St. Peter's Basilica, marking the formal end of the Catholic Church's Jubilee or Holy Year. A record 33.5 million pilgrims visited Rome during the Holy Year. In a final message for the year, Pope Leo urged Christians around the world to treat foreigners with kindness and recognize them as fellow pilgrims and neighbors. And Malaysia says it has issued fines and community service orders to 120 people in the country as part of a new law on littering that went into effect at the start of the year. Among those fined are 34 foreigners and 3 Singaporeans, a fact that was highlighted by Malaysia's housing and local government minister, who vowed to make his country even cleaner than Singapore. Those are today's headlines. Back to you, Tom.
Thank you very much indeed, Carlotta, and we shall bring you refreshed headlines at the top of the next hour, 1300 here in London. Now, as we were just hearing from Carlotta, President Macron is hosting his Ukrainian counterpart, Volodymyr Zelensky, and other coalition of the willing partners in Paris to try and advance the coherence of potential security arrangements in the event of a ceasefire agreement with the Russians. In the meantime, though, there's been a very significant cabinet shake-up back home in Kyiv. For more on that, I'm joined now, I'm delighted to say, by Monocle writer and Ukraine expert Julia Jen. Good afternoon, Julia, and belatedly a Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year, Tom.
Now, tell me, this cabinet reshuffle, there's some quite striking names in the mix, but it's a pretty significant moment, as you alluded to at the top of the show. Tell us what's happened.
Absolutely. So, as I said, Canada's former Deputy Prime Minister, so this is Chrystia Freeland, she's held very senior positions in the Canadian government. At one point, she was Minister of Foreign Affairs. She was Minister of Finance between 2020 and 2024. So that's an absolutely critical time to be at the helm of the Canadian government. She has actually just been appointed as Ukraine's economic development advisor. So she's resigning as a Canadian MP, and she's going to take over that role now in Ukraine. It's an unpaid role, and so she'll be essentially an advisor to Zelensky. She's one of the key people that we've seen being appointed now into new roles. At the very beginning of the year, actually, just a few days ago, we had another significant reshuffle. We had Kirilo Budanov, who was the head of military intelligence. He stepped up to become the head of the Office of the President of Ukraine. So that's replacing a vacant role, which we discussed, who used to be in that role very much in this program last year in 2025, Yermak, who, was leading Ukraine's negotiation effort. And now we have this man coming from military intelligence who's much more adept at running sort of military operations, gathering intelligence, in Russian territory, super high risk work. He's now going to be heading up Zelensky's team. And we have a few other sort of reshuffles. We've got Mikhailo Fedorov, who used to be the digital transformation minister. He's only 34 years old. He's very young. Monocle has interviewed him before. He's kind of really seen as a mover and shaker of things in Ukrainian parliament, cutting red tape, cutting bureaucracy. He's going to be the defense minister, which is a huge deal. Defense ministries across the world are sort of lumbering giants of bureaucracy and slow-moving processes and procurement programs, etc. And he's coming in there, and I think we're going to see some big changes in the defense ministry because of him. Well,
at the risk of asking an impossible question, it is interesting to look at what these appointments could mean in terms of pivots in Zelensky's approach. We talked about his personnel problems with his close advisor and all the rest of it. The Freeland appointment is interesting. The Fedorov is certainly striking. Do we begin to see potentially, especially with what's going on concurrently in Paris, what the next phase of his presidency or the sort of post-hot conflict phase might be looking like?
Absolutely. People are talking about this as him preparing potentially for elections. So if we look at the corruption scandal that plagued, Ukrainian politics for most of last year, Yermak, his former top advisor, he had his ear, and he was sort of seen as key as leading Zelensky into these really disastrous decisions on cutting back independence for Ukraine's anti-graft agencies and really damaging trust between Ukraine and Ukraine's Western allies. Bringing in fresh blood here, Kirilo Budanov, bringing in someone who is so popular in Ukrainian politics, among Ukraine's population, and really in Ukrainian politics seen as a very sort of a thinker who kind of doesn't take the same position as everyone else. His sort of fresh thinking, his sort of fearlessness, his bravery. He actually survived an assassination attempt, him and his wife, last year. And he has fought on Ukraine's front from 2014. So he really knows the realities of the war. But he takes a very ironic approach. He has, Ukrainians love his sort of video messages because he takes very sort of, ironic, humorous stances. He brings a bit of levity into his work, which is really, novel because he's dealing with some very serious military operations. And bringing in him is that Zelensky setting up his sort of, team for the election? Is that him bringing in a political opponent? I think the big test with Budanov and with Chrystia Freeland, so that former Canadian MP, Minister of Finance, will Zelensky's ear be open to them? Will he actually be listening to their advice? That's the big test, I think, of this year. 2025, we saw Zelensky, as I said, being led onto these unpopular decisions and making decisions that really shoring up his position in a way that didn't favour Ukraine and in fact really put Ukraine in peril. Is this year, is he going to open himself up to advice that he might not like, but Chrystia Freeland, Budanov, other figures, they will be giving it to him straight and they'll be saying, you have to do this. This is for Ukraine's survival, because these figures in particular really do have Ukraine's survival, centre of their sort of mission. And we see that Chrystia Freeland, in fact, in her role, it's been sort of outlined that she will be advising on the post-war reconstruction of Ukraine. That's going to see huge sums of money moving in and out of Ukraine. It's absolutely critical that there's someone in charge of that who is seen as totally trustworthy by the allies. And, of course, that's a role that will involve a lot of negotiations with the US, who are so invested in what is going to happen in terms of post-war reconstruction, where money can be made. And it's really interesting to have a Canadian there potentially putting up a bit of defence to the US.
It's interesting because one of the sort of gauntlets that I remember you saying that Ukrainians and you kind of personally wanted to sort of lay down to Zelensky was to bring in that diversity of viewpoints. It feels like he's done that a little bit. Just really quickly, Julia, will this land domestically, politically? You mentioned elections. Will these appointments help to convince people that Zelensky has kind of changed and he's able to deliver that longer term view with the reconstruction of the country in mind?
I think any, leader who's really been through a war, I think people understand it's time for them to take a step back when that war is over. We had it here in this country with Churchill after the war. He wasn't re-elected. He was sort of asked by the public, take a break now. I think people are understanding that it is so important and these reshuffles keep happening in Ukrainian politics. This is a huge one because, as we said, fresh blood being brought in, fresh opinions, fresh perspectives, and really people who are not seen as Zelensky's people, sort of not the old guard. That's super significant, but I think people are very keen for some sort of change once the time is right. Of course, now people are very understanding the time is not right. Elections cannot be held in wartime. That's absolutely not something that we can discuss. But, I think there is that desire for change. And that's why these appointments are so welcome.
Julia, as ever, great to hear from you on the programme. Our Julia Jen bringing us up to speed with events in Kyiv. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You're back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. It is exactly 19 minutes past midday here in London town. Joining me around the table here in Studio 1 of Midori House in London, Monocle's design editor, Nick Monisse. Hello, Nick.
Hello, Tom Edwards. Can I just say,
go on,
huge developments in the last 20 minutes since we did I was down here at the start of the show.
Yes.
Went back upstairs, snowing, magical. It's a winter wonderland outside in London. It's just, the city is coated in, it's been like lightly dusted with, what do you call it, icing sugar. It looks beautiful.
It's a city that never fails to surprise. Frequently on the downside.
Well, yeah, unfortunately, but it looks beautiful. I mean, we're going to talk design. I mean, this is one of those things where sometimes nature can enhance an experience of a place, a work of architecture. I'm looking down Chiltern Street, and it's just beautiful, right?
And it has been, I'm going to say, chilly over the last couple of days. How does proud Aussie like yourself you clearly don't dress really correctly for any office, but certainly for these kind of inclement conditions. How do you manage?
Well, that's great.
You got some long johns on under there?
I appreciate that question because I do have long johns on.
You don't really do.
I have to have long johns on. But Tom, hang on. I'm going to bring everything back to design. That's all I'm going to do. I'm going to be the consummate professional. They're 3/4 length long johns, so it means that if I'm sitting in a meeting and perhaps I cross my legs, a little bit of leg,
doing it now,
a little bit of leg comes on display.
Oh, quite a lot.
You don't see the long john, so I don't look like I can't handle it, but I can't handle it. Do you follow?
Let's just let that one hang there in the radio ether for a second. Nick, this is amazingly not what we're here to talk about.
Disappointing.
There's plenty going on. You've got always a busy itinerary, fairs, key weeks and events on the design calendar, and maybe how that shapes your thinking in terms of your own work. Tell us what is on the agenda for you, where you're headed, and what our listeners and readers should be listening and looking out for.
Well, I'm kicking off the year in Paris, where we obviously have an office there, and there's a rotating team heading through there. Our producer Anita Riota is there right now. I'll be joining her next week there for Maison&Objet, which is it's a trade fair. It happens twice a year. There's a winter one and a summer one, kind of like fashion weeks. Quite an important event. But what's happening, and this is happening in design trade fairs across the globe, there's a shift to the city. People actually, it's kind of like, it's a form of shopping. People would much rather wander through a downtown probably than be in a huge air-conditioned mall. So this has become kind of a de facto design week in the city. Paris Deco Off also takes place, which across the city, and that's all about kind of wallpaper, furnishings, those sorts of wall coverings, details, upholstery, those sorts of things. But then in amongst that, brands are presenting new work, things that they've worked on since the summer edition of Paris's Maison&Objet and Design Week. But I guess the reason I'm going there is I feel like Paris has emerged in recent years as this really strong design center, global design center. I mean, people often think Milan, and you're probably going there for industry, and certainly Monocle will be there in April for Salone del Mobile. But Paris it's a place where craft has really come to the fore, and I think people are actively seeking that out a little bit more. Perhaps it's the tradition of the atelier. You've got the whole fashion side of things as well. It all sort of is combining. There's a confluence taking place in Paris at the moment, and I think that's what I'm particularly looking forward to. So it's not so much about industrial scale design while I'm there, but more about who are the new emerging designers, what are the bespoke pieces that they're creating, and what am I going to be able to see.
And listeners will be able to hear what you discover on your journeys, of course, on our programme Monocle on Design, also in the Monocle on Design newsletter, and across all of Monocle's publications and output, for which they should sign up and find out more at our website, monocle.com, including taking out a subscription to the magazine so we can pay all of Nick's lavish hotel bills as he crisscrosses the globe. Nick, what about surprise? Obviously, you can't know surprises by definition, but are you looking forward to, I don't know, touching down in a market that's a little bit off the beaten track that might have some surprises for you and the team from a design perspective?
From a design perspective, I mean, if we're talking big reports this year, if we're shifting away, I guess, from the event side of things, I'm going to be turning my attention more to Africa. I think there's a lot of exciting things taking place there. If we're building on this idea of people looking for bespoke, more unique pieces, as I'm talking about in Paris previously, I think Lagos is really emerging as a big hub in Africa for that. There's this amazing design scene taking place there, led by the likes of people such as Nefemi Marcus Bello, who's again been on Monocle on Design as discussed. And this is all about, I guess, harnessing those craft traditions that they have there, because they're in this, it's an emerging economy. They have this opportunity to kind of look at what's happening in the West and perhaps reposition themselves. And I think people like Nefemi are tapping into skilled craftspeople that are there to produce works that have global appeal. So I think that's quite fascinating. But then, in addition to that, I think there's lots of amazing architecture being finished on the continent right now. There's going to be several new parliaments opening up next year. I'm trying to kind of link together a little road trip for myself, a little geopolitical architecture tour, if you will. And I think lots of these are going to be drawing from, Francis Kéré, Pritzker Prize winning architect, is completing one in Benin. And, a lot of this is looking at, I guess, these vernacular architectures, these, knowledge inherent in a place, and then translating them to a more contemporary form. So I think a lot of that is going to be taking place. So they're my kind of two things that are going to be emerging.
So he was talking Long Johns, but he's pretty good, listeners, isn't he? Once he gets warmed up, ironically enough. Any other places on your hit list? Any others you not mention, just quickly?
I mean, I think less off the beaten track, but this has just become the theme of this. And these radio shows are also very helpful for me because I start to clarify my thoughts. I think Nomad in San Moritz. This is a design fair. It's the San Moritz edition, but it takes place across the globe. There's I believe there was one in Doha. I want to say
it was in Abu Dhabi.
Abu Dhabi. You were there, weren't you?
It was absolutely brilliant.
Well, this is exactly.
It might be back, so you should put that in your agenda for 27.
If we're talking confluences, this is art, architecture, design kind of coming together. A lot of a focus on, I guess, more bespoke, collectible, individual pieces. And I think that's, as I've realised in this conversation, going to all of a sudden become a focus for me in 2026, which is quite exciting.
He's learning by doing, listeners. You could literally hear the cogs whirring around. Nick, always great fun to chat to you. Thanks for joining us here on The Briefing. And that is your lot for this Tuesday edition. Big thanks to Nick. Thanks to our producer, Chris Chermack, and to our studio manager, Steph Chungu. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow noon in London. I think Chris Chermack will be in the chair. Will he be? He's in the... Yes, thumbs up from Chris Chermack. Tune in, join him tomorrow at noon London time. But from me, Tom Edwards, and the Tuesday crew, goodbye and thanks for listening.